So we left off the last month by Denny saying, you know, we've done enough damage for today, and I said, well, and we've done enough good for today. So I thought we'd just pick up with that and say, well, it's time to do more good here. So here we go. So we talked. We were originally thought that, you know, well, what about, because Denny and I, we not really ruts fall into, but we tend to bring up kind of similar things often. So we thought, you know, why don't we pick topics that we've never talked about ever before on the show? And we said, you know, let's pick 3 topics each, and then limit it to an hour, which it's gonna be really hard to do now that we're a little bit late on this, but or maybe just an hour in length. And Denny only came up with 1 though, and I said if we only get to 1, that'll be okay. So I've got 2 actually, and if there's any time left, maybe we'll throw in a wild card there. Yeah. So I guess we'll just yeah.
So let me share the
Sure.
screen, and then we could go from there. So today's topic, actually I picked the topic after we decide on the 3 main points, and
And I had originally titled the show Lightning Round or Light Rain, 3 questions each. And that actually came from, real quick, a Thai saying that the royalty asked Ajahn Chah for a bio because they were going to give him a real high honor. And he put him off and put him off, put him off. And finally he got back with his bio, and it was, sometimes there's thunder and no rain, sometimes there's rain and no thunder. And apparently that's a Thai saying that it means that, heard this from Ajahn Amaro, which is a funny, you know, British monastic, but very charismatic too. But apparently that Thai saying means that, you know, sometimes there's a personality type, but there's no nourishment. So like thunder, right? But there's no rain. But then sometimes it's the opposite, where it's a real nourishing, beneficial thing, but there's no really, you know, figurehead or, you know, really strong personality to drive it. So I don't know, play on that. Anyway, so yeah, so we'll see. So I guess I'll just kick it off here, Denny, right? Okay, so the first topic is, what is Kusala, sexual energy? And Kusala means wholesome, skillful, right? And kind of wise. Because we hear about, I guess we can go to the next slide, Denny, and then we hear about the 5 training precepts, and they're framed in refraining from, right? So it's like what you're training to not do. So it's kind of framed in a negative, not in a negative overall sense, but just as, you know, positive, negative, affirmative, or whatever. So it's usually talked about refraining from misusing sexual energy. Well, when I hear that, and some other people too, it's like, well, what does that mean? Well, I guess some of these, and I'm going to throw it back to Denny here in a second after this, and see what he gets by that. But from what I understand here, it basically means avoiding breaking up relationships that are already established, right? So if somebody's married, obviously you're not going to go, you know, try to break up that marriage. And then also having sexual activity only within committed relationships. So that makes things a lot less disasters can happen that way, right? So, you know, so I'm going to ask Denny here about that. And also, I'm just going to lightly touch on this topic because of it, and we'll get into that on the next slide. But Denny, what would you say? What is not misusing sexual energy? What does that mean to you?
well, the problem is that it depends who you ask, and so I tend to go. I try to go back to the time and space. You know, when the historical Buddha was essentially a yogi, right? And I said, you know, what exactly was he trying to accomplish? And so I think if we go back to the saying about Kusala, which is wholesome, how do you live a life that is good for you, as opposed to living a life that lives up to the standard of some external feminine body, right? Then it's really a set of behavior that is quote unquote good for your karma. Okay. Josh, I'm going to mute you for a minute because you have a lot of air conditioning noise. Okay, so when you want to talk, just raise your thumb. Okay, and so the question is really, how do you live a wholesome life? And so again, it depends on who you ask, because um, the sexual part wasn't even the first one, right? The first one is really killing, more about killing. So it's not even about eating meat. It's about killing. So you can actually, there are ways that you can eat meat, like, if you found it on the side of the street, if if it was a result of some animal fighting, and then there's carcass that you can pick up. So there's all kinds of ways that you can actually eat meat, but it's all about killing, and it's all about stealing, and when it eventually gets to the sexual part, it's really all about behavior. And so I think the idea of one man, one woman, and the idea of sexual relationship or sexual activity is really solely for the purpose of reproduction. So that's a very strict, very, very strict way of defining misuse of sexual energy. So if you do that, that's even exclude homosexual behavior, that exclude, like anal sex and masturbation, all that, because those has nothing to do with reproduction. So it depends who you ask. It really depends who you are. But at the very minimum, I think having sexual relationship outside of marriage is definitely not something that you wanted to do if you want to have a kusala life. Then the question is that, well, what does that mean? Does that mean sex before marriage is a bad thing? It, it really depends who you ask. And I think what's more important is that the Buddhist teaching is not about a strict set of rules that you have to abide to in order to satisfy some outside governing body. It's much more about you and how you think you want to live, and how that helps your practice towards a better human being. Okay?
This is
Oops. Oh, sorry, Josh. I thought you were unmute. Go
oh,
ahead.
okay. That's a great point, because the first precept is, non-harming, and that's kind of like the base of it all, right? So how can we not harm around our sexual energy, right? So
Yeah,
that's
but
it.
even the first one, when we say no killing, it
Hmm.
also depends on intention.
Oh
So
yes.
if you're in the forest and a lion charge towards you, and you have to kill the lion, for the purpose of protecting yourself and your family, then it's killing, but but without a bad intention. So it varies. It's really, I think, again, the importance is that you are your own master.
And this is another, we hear that example about, if you step on an ant and you have no idea you step on it, it's not going to create a negative karmic effect as if you saw the ant and then you had hatred towards it and then you intentionally went out of your way to kill the ant. That's different, right?
Yeah. So even, for example, the Chinese, because actually, for example, Buddha never a vegetarian, because they're you know the, they are essentially beggars. They have to go and beg for food. So um, and also the way that they do that is that they don't repeat the same location. So they would, each day they would choose a different direction. So there's no expectation that they would be there at a certain time of the day, and so people don't kill for them. You know.
That's right. I remember talking about this before, and
Yeah.
the exception is that if they know for certain that the person has killed the meat just for them, killed
Yeah.
the animal, just they
So
can't
so
accept
so
it.
the Chinese
Otherwise, it's
Buddhists,
okay.
yeah, the
Hmm.
Chinese Buddhists take it to a different level, and they basically says we have to be vegetarian. And so there are people who cannot be vegetarian, or transition to being vegetarian. They can eat meat, but they cannot go and point to a live animal and says, kill this one. Like, they can't do that, right? So then people would say, well, what if I send my friend to kill for me? Well, they no, 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 because the intention is wrong.
That's right. You're inciting someone else to kill for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it depends where you live too. I guess with monastics, there's some areas of the world where people just don't, get it, and they won't even get requisites. So then they have to do things that aren't, traditionally. They have to go by other means, like, sometimes there's just places where they just go on alms rounds. They don't keep any food overnight where they live, and other places do, and some people, they have lay people bringing it out. Sometimes they don't. So, from what I've heard anyway. So I
Yeah,
get,
yeah.
yeah.
So,
So I
so
get,
my take on misusing sexual energy or sexual inappropriate sexual activity, I would just say that back to intent again.
that's a
Back
great
to
way to frame it.
intent. I
Yes.
think in the modern society, what is the intent, right?
That's right. Does it lead
Yeah,
towards our happiness and long-term benefit and the happiness and long-term benefits of others, or is
yeah,
it the opposite, right?
yeah. So that I think that that's one. Then the other one is that I think we spend way too much time arguing at the gate,
Oh yeah.
right? As opposed to just walk across, walk over the threshold and just focus on the practice and let the practice guide you as opposed to, trying to adhere to a set of guidance and, and thinking that if you do that, that is a practice. That is not the practice.
That's right. A lot of this is almost even theoretical too, which I mean, it has its place, but practice outweighs it in my opinion as well. So what the so like I said, these are usually couched in the negative. So usually when there's a negative, there's also a positive, right? But I mean, like refraining from, okay, but now what do you, is there a way to,
I
what you
think, John,
actually do?
I
So
think this
yeah.
is a very important point. This is really
Yes.
a very important point is that when we think of monastics, we
Hmm.
think of them giving up things. When we think of monastics, we think of them having to live in a very restricted lifestyle, you know, and so when we think of the five precepts, starting with no killing, no stealing, no lying, no sexual misconduct, no
Intoxicants.
intoxicants, we tend to think of it as negative. It's like, okay, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that, and then and then because once you focus on that, then the next thing you focus is then that well, what's left, right? What can I do? And maybe if I just do that, then that's that would be the gate to the heaven or whatever it is that you go after. I tend to think of the precept in positive, in positive. And this is especially true when you go from the five precepts to what we call the Bodhisattva precepts. And when you look at the Bodhisattva precepts, there's almost half like 64 of them. And so if you look at that and you say, well, wait a minute, I go from 5 to 69 or whatever number it is, I forgot that in a moment. And so, I mean, does that mean that it's 10 times as more difficult? But actually, when you look at the Bodhisattva precept, they're not actually precept as much as they are vows. There are commitments that you make to really live the Bodhisattva path, right? And so you really have to look at the five precepts not as restrictions and but more like a commitment, more like a vow. And you have to look at it in a very positive way and say, if I do this, it will just help with my practice. So the commitment you should make is to your practice and not to the set of rules. Because if you make the commitment to the practice, then the rules would help you. They're like a field that propel you along that path.
And also remember the practice is leading towards even a higher happiness, right? So that famous saying, well, yes, there is happiness in everyday life, but that's a lower form of happiness. If you were given the chance to give up a lower form of happiness for a higher form of happiness, would you do it? And I think that's the key question. And the ground level here is these five precepts. And back when I was living a very unwholesome, unwise lifestyle, I would have just kind of laughed at these and said, that's just too prudish, that's ridiculous. How are we going to have any fun or enjoyment with these? And unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, things got rough where then I started learning about these things, and it gradually can see more and more how these things aren't there to limit and restrict us, but they're actually there to help us get to a higher happiness, right? But you can't really convince anybody about this. You just have to kind of see the wisdom in it, and then you have to try it out for yourself, right? You have to see how these things can actually lead to a higher happiness for yourself.
Yeah, that's right. Josh, if I may, I'd like to just add one thing to what you said, which I agree with 100%. That is, it is actually my experience is that it's actually very difficult to have a conversation about happiness because each person has his own definition of happiness. That's one, and the other one is that in order to seek happiness, you have to start with unhappiness. And each one has its own definitions and pain threshold for what is unhappy. So it's, my experience, my own experience is actually very difficult to do that. So what I choose to do is not to talk about happiness, but talk about freedom of choice, freedom of choice. So when we talk about this country, being the land of liberty, what we're really talking about is choice. You can choose, right? So, as simple as the definition of patriotism, the true patriotism is giving everybody a choice. You can choose to burn the flag, and I won't call it unpatriotic because that's true patriotism is that you do have that choice within boundary. Okay, so my thought on that is the conversation that I typically have is less about my happiness because that tend to, in my limited ability to communicate, is that it tend to kind of went sideways. But instead, I asked the question: is how important it is to have choice, and 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 how important it is to have choice not only on material but also on spiritual matter. And so I give you an example. So one time I was in mainland China with Master Jiru, and in the evening we had these very lively discussions with the students because they know I come from America and they know I'm a businessman and all that. So they like to hear about America, and also because Master had already went into his own chamber, so now we are free, right? So we were talking about, and they're very careful about saying things, and so they have to get a lot of comfort level, and so eventually we talk about freedom, and so of course the answer is that communist China is not free, and so when I say that no, I actually think that China is a very free country because you have a lot of choices. And so they kind of look at me and says, well, remember we went to the supermarket today. Look at all the choices you have, in terms of, like if you go to China, you just wouldn't believe that this is China. I mean, they have more choices in the supermarket than anywhere else in the world, as much as even if not more than America. They have everything we have plus what they have, So if you define freedom, which then indirectly define happiness as choice, you have to start out with material choices. And so typically when I talk to people, rather than talk about happiness, I say, well, let's talk about material choices, right? The freedom to choose. Now, what if then the ability to choose your material well-being is obviously important, right? But what if there's a possibility of choices in your spiritual manner? How do I choose, right? What does that mean? That's a conversation you can have, which is how do I choose? Like I remember you said it very well when you said, like if somebody shoots you with an arrow, it hurts. But the first time it hurts, you lay the blame on that person who hurt you. But typically we continue to hurt. We took the arrow out and then we keep stabbing ourselves, right? Because when somebody says something bad to you, that was like 2 weeks ago, but it still hurts. But who's hurting you now? And so the question is, well, what if you can actually choose? What if you can actually choose any mental action, right? So that to me is the ultimate freedom because it's the ultimate choice. I can choose to be miserable, right? But I can also choose not to be miserable. But if you don't have these other choice, then you are stuck. You're not committed to your misery. You are stuck in your misery, right? What do you
This,
think, Josh?
this is a great point, and thanks for reminding me because it supersedes happiness in my opinion as well.
Yeah,
Because and it is great to have external choices, and America is, it's decent in that. The thing is that those external choices can distract so many people into thinking that is the ultimate real freedom, when it's just kind of a farce, where the real ultimate freedom is what Denny was talking about at the end, is that choice to have that well, first, the choice to pursue your own spiritual practice, right? That's where the real freedom's going to come from. But so many people think that they're going to have this external freedom, and it's only just a little tiny taste of what's available when we start to free our own mind through our own practice, right?
Right. So to summarize this slide, I would say that the practice is about developing the skills so that we can make these free choices, okay, in terms of how emotional or spiritual choices. And the precepts are tools that allows you to make progress along that path. And these precepts are positive, they're not negative. They're not, so I think it's wrong to look at one side of the coin and says, oh, it's so restrictive, all these things I couldn't do, let's figure out what I can do. And thinking that, if I could just find that crack, and then now, I can still live my life, quote unquote, and do this too, right?
They're set up to cause positive results in our lives. Yeah.
They're there to help you. Okay, so should we go to the next slide?
Sure. So, but if we were to couch, the what is the skillful use of sexual energy, then I would say, instead of what we're not supposed to do with sexual energy, I would say it's skillful and appropriate relational energy. And now we're going to come back to that because that's kind of what I can talk about more. But I just wanted to skim with the next slide some of the and touch into just kind of exploring more what this sexual energy is or whatever.
Okay, go ahead.
So you want to go to the next slide?
Okay.
So yeah, most anything of sexual nature in the West here is taboo, and sometimes it's for good reasons, sometimes it's not. Sometimes there's skillful and wise reasons for that, and sometimes there's unskillful and wise reasons of why sexuality is taboo in the West here, and I'm sure plenty of the world as well.
Well, the West is different from the East. The West is different from the East, and let me, I spent a long time really understanding the difference. So it turns out that in the West, we don't have a separate and standalone set of morality. When we say morality, we don't know how to separate morality from religion, right? So in order to talk about moral, we have to say, well, how is that? How does the church define that? So what happens is that you have this imbalance between what the church define as morality and what yourself might define as morality. Okay, and so the church define anything that is sexual as immoral, and most of us don't accept that. Most of us accept some of it, but not all of it. And so there's always this dichotomy or contradiction, between being sexual and being immoral. And if you go anywhere else in the world, or even big part of Europe, that's not always the case. That being sexual is not necessary being immoral. Now, that's especially true if you come to Asia, because Asia actually has a standalone set of morality that is independent of religion. In fact, you can go as far as saying that in China, we never had a tradition of religion, because most of our code of conduct, it comes from Confucius. And the purpose of that is not so that you can go to heaven or the opposite, but rather than that it is a set of rules that you adhere to in order to have harmony in the society. Okay, so it's very easy then for us to separate sexuality from morality that way. And so this slide is you said it correctly, that it's important part is that it is in the West. This is the problem in the West. Yeah.
That's right. I was just going to say that it is important, and I didn't point this out, what Denny was saying, and I forget this sometimes that even though less and less people are religious, increasingly so here in the West, that kind of what Denny was talking about is still really established in Western society. Those codes from the church, and it reminded me of the old joke around religion is here in the West is having sex is filthy and dirty and shameful, so save it for the one that you love. And so it's confusing, and it is. The next slide we'll see it's cognitive dissonance, a lot of it,
But
which
before we go to
basically.
the next slide, so let's just talk about how the Buddhists view this thing. How does the Buddha view sexuality versus morality? Josh?
Oh, I thought that was a rhetorical question. You were gonna
Well,
you
it
were gonna
is.
answer it.
So that means you have to answer
I see.
it.
So that's great, because obviously, in Buddhism and in formal, there's a monastic community and then there's a lay community, and obviously the lay community is procreating, and the monastics have a strict code where they refrain from sexual activity, right? So now the question you asked was, now say it one more time.
Oh, so basically you answer the question, which is it
Okay.
depends on whether you talk about the householder or the monastics. So the monastics is that not only do they have to be moral, that they have to be asexual, but they don't do that because they equate sexuality with morality. It's just their practice that they have to be moral all the time, and they have to be asexual all the time, and not because the two are related, right? And whereas what their expectation of the householder is that they don't actually talk about the sexuality part as much, as long as they fall into the morality part. They focus more on the morality, and if that turned out to be sexual, then that's sexual.
That's right.
What you do
And
in your bedroom is your business, as
yes,
they
I totally,
say.
exactly. And it just makes things so much simpler with the monastic of refraining from sex altogether. Then you don't even have to go into these questions that we're going into, right?
Yeah.
You save so much time, not even have to, this is the way it is, and you can see the benefit, and that's the way it is. And they even encourage lay practitioners on occasion, to do the same thing, like during retreat and during certain, I don't know, maybe full moon days and different sits during the year as well. So
Yeah.
yeah,
So
yeah.
there's always a saying that, what would Jesus do? Right? The idea is that, this is a conversation that people have among the Protestants or the Catholics, which is, should we discriminate against the gays and the lesbians, or, should we do, because then the question, what would Jesus do? And the people who ask that question, basically they're telling us that no, Jesus would never do that. Jesus would never discriminate against, people who are different, because Jesus, the historical Jesus, at least when you look at his teaching, is based on compassion and loving kindness and empathy. And so I think the modern Buddhists forget about the traditional and the interpretation of what traditional Buddhism means. But at least today, the modern Buddhism is with one word. We tend to focus more on compassion, loving kindness, and empathy, and rather than talking about all these little technical issues on whether they is it moral, is it immoral to have anal sex, is it immoral to have masturbation, is it immoral to have sex before marriage, is it immoral to have sex with more than one woman, you know all that might not be important, but what is more important is going back to compassion, loving kindness, and empathy, because without that you shouldn't even call yourself a Buddhist.
I couldn't agree more, Denny. I think it was Kurt Vonnegut that said too, is that kindness is the only rule in life, because that supersedes it's just about everything, especially in everyday life. And we'll come back to
Well,
that too with the
I go
relational.
even further, Josh.
Hmm.
I would say that kindness is the only reward in life.
Oh, I said only rule, but yeah, and reward too. It is a
It is the
reward
only
as well.
reward. I mean,
It's
it's the
reward
ultimate
as a
reward.
rule.
It's the
Yeah,
ultimate reward. Why
totally.
do we do what we do? Because we recognize it as our reward, our ultimate reward. That when you're kind to someone, you have to be kind to yourself. You are the first beneficiary, you know. Okay.
But you know, and I don't even really look at it as reward and punishment. It's just like that is our natural human state. Like when the
That is.
defilements fall away, that's just our
Yeah.
natural way. We don't even have to try, you know?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
some people say the
Exactly.
baseline of loving kindness is just an absence of ill will. That's it,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know?
exactly, exactly. It's like last time I talked about when I asked my students, my small army of Cantonese speaking, grandmas, and I asked them rhetorically. I said, well, how is the sun today? They said, oh, there's no sun. How was it yesterday? Well, yesterday was great. The sun was out. And I said, no, the sun is always out. Your compassion, loving kindness, and empathy are always there. And it's just like you said, Josh. You said when it's over covered by the hindrances, the black cloud, you don't get to see it. You don't get to see it. So when you are kind to someone, then essentially you're pushing away that black cloud, and the first person who benefit from that shine that comes from you within is yourself. You know, forget about changing the world and benefiting the world. That's just how about me?
And ironically, it does it. It's, you know, that actually does change the world. Even if you
Yeah.
can't see it, it does. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Okay. Good.
Okay,
Okay.
so the next thing is just real briefly here. If anybody's interested in any of these things, then they can contact me. I haven't decided if I'm going to link to them yet or not in the show notes, but you know, we talked about the cognitive dissonance of this, which basically means you're holding two opposing views in mind at the same time, and sometimes they make people go, you know, haywire sometimes because it's hard for people to hold two contradictory views in mind. Some people can, okay, and that's actually very beneficial because we're confronted with that throughout daily life a bunch. So there's a cognitive dissonance of you turn on a TV, which I don't own a TV anymore, but there's this, at least the last time I watched it, there's this hyper sexualization and it's promoted in the media, right? So you see all these famous people and how they're dressing, they're behaving, they're trying to sleep with everybody, sleep their way up the corporate ladder or whatever, and all this just very kind of ridiculous type of behavior, in my opinion. Or I would say unskillful and unhelpful, you know, and obviously unwholesome. But then again, it's on TV, so is it real? Is it not? Who knows? And then there's also, but then there's so it's just like people are, I guess, programmed. They call it television programming too. Well, if that's how they see people on TV and they're getting ahead, well then maybe I should behave like this. Maybe I'll get ahead. But then when you get into, you know, reports in the media about this Me Too movement where, you know, these women are finally coming together and speaking out on how they've been sexually harassed, and actually it can be the reverse too. Men every once in a while can get sexually harassed too. But then there's also all these different conflicting things like sexual repression. You know, you have people that are afraid to express their sexuality too. So it goes to the other extreme. You have dress codes, which can be both ways. Like some people can say they're too strict. Some people say they're not strict enough. Some people cover head to toe. Some people, you know, are just walking around almost half naked. And then you have one camp saying you shouldn't do that, and the other camp saying you shouldn't do that to the other camp. So then there's also this thing called princess programming. I tried to look for my like 6-year-old niece not too long ago, or previous birthdays, and you go down a toy aisle, and it's really nothing but princesses, at least the last time I checked, right? There's all these different Disney princesses, and there's hardly any other toys for young girls. And I really won't go into that much now, but they're basically, other than to say, they're kind of being conditioned to act like a princess. Sometimes we can see the good things in that, but we can also see now, can everybody be a princess, or should everybody be a princess, and what can that lead to? I'll leave that up for your own exploration. There's this term toxic masculinity, and I see that sometimes, and I also see how that can also just turn men and women off from each other altogether. Or, you know, where people get that condition and they just think all masculinity is toxic, right? Which is not the case. There's some kind of emaciated masculine types where they're over feminine and they're disempowered and they're afraid to embrace masculinity. But then there's also the other extreme, like the toxic masculinity, where they go too far and they act out and, you know, So we can see that. The next thing is a huge topic in especially university crowds. This I'm calling it gender confusion, and I that's a whole. I mean, that's a whole another show as well. So I'm just gonna leave that topic. I'm sure people can kind of interpret that as well.
Yeah.
All the things that go
So
on with
Josh,
that,
so
and then the
so
battle of the sexes I kind of mentioned already, and that's
yeah,
been going on since time immemorial, right?
yeah,
Men, women. What are a lot of the old sitcoms based on? This fight between the man and the woman, right? Between and that just whole shows and books and just tons of culture have been on this. So.
yeah, yeah. So after you show me the slides that you prepare and knowing what I wanted to prepare, I decided that the topic for today should be called practicing in the desire realm. So the word desire actually comes from the Sanskrit word called kama, kama, K-A-M-A, which actually is more than desire. It's actually called sensory desire. And so the idea is that once you have these sensors, and the sensors are not just the eye, the ear, the nose, and the tongue, and the body, but also a thinking brain. Okay, so these are their windows to the material world. And once you have those, then it creates desire and stimulants and and um, and reactions and excitements and all that, right? And so everything that you talk about, which was a very good list, I thought, and there are more, is that they're really talking about these sensations and stimulants in this material world, and they're there because we are equipped with the sensors and therefore the desire, right? And so there are people out there, they do it either for money, they do it for fame, they do it for all kinds of reasons, for their own ego, that create this kind of intoxication, right? They're no different. They're no different than your cocaine and your LSD and your marijuana and your opium. That they're there to kind of put you in that state of excitement and to a certain extent enjoyment and the ups and the downs, right? And so people do that because there are audience for it. Our last president was a president because there was audience for him, right? Now, do you remember a TV show called Taxi?
Yes, that was right around I'm still old enough to remember that. One
Yeah,
other thing
okay.
real
So
quick that came, go ahead.
yeah, go ahead, Josh.
I was just going to
Taxi.
say another thing too that I left off this list is, well, they do it for power as well, and people will have these. They'll either withhold sex or they'll bait people with sex, and then they can use that as kind of an ego thing of getting ahead in power too.
Yeah.
So.
So in this TV series called Taxi, which is one of my favorite, all-time favorite, there's a character called Doc, Doctor, and he's the same actor that was in the Back to the Future series. Remember that? And so his character, he was a driver, but his character is that he's always out there, he's always on drugs, he's always like that. And so one time the story was that they found a bag of drugs, pills or whatever, in the back seat of the car. And so all the drivers are getting very excited. Should we turn it in? Should we, what should we do? Because obviously, it could have been marijuana or something. And Doc walked by and kind of look over, and they see all that excitement. He see all that excitement, and then so everybody's looking at him because he's the expert on drugs that. And so he just kind of say, there is only one problem with drugs. There's a really bad side effect. And everyone's looking at him and say, wow, what is he talking about side effect? He says, they eventually wear off. So
Yeah.
all these, so when I talk about these stimulants, all the things that you talk about, all these contradictions and and struggles that we have in this desire realm. Okay, so you gotta limit yourself to this desire realm that we live in. Okay, all these things will eventually wear off. All these highs that you get from the dress and the toys, and I'm thinking of buying a Porsche, all that stuff, they're great. I'm not discounting any of that. I will not ever discount the power of money, and because they will buy your happiness, they will. It's just that they will wear off. And so what we're talking about practicing in a way is working towards graduating from this desire realm, ultimately to have joy and that maybe wear off a little less, or maybe it would never wear off. We don't know. We haven't got there yet. So
Great point. There's a classic saying, even a rain of gold wouldn't be enough.
yeah, yeah,
Because however much we have, we want more. Yep,
yeah.
and it wears off. That's right. So
Okay.
now back to, well, what is that? What is appropriate or skillful sexual energy? And this is where it's into relational energy. And I heard this recently from a talk by Ajahn Sucitto. And this kind of sexual energy, this kind of urge to connect, right? So instead of acting on it or repressing it all the time or in unwholesome, unskillful, unwise ways, could it be possible to use this energy to connect in a appropriate way? Not just in our intimate relationships. That's where it's a little more obvious with the sexual energy, but this energy to connect in all of our relationships, like with our friendships, with teachers and students. But obviously, it's not going to be the same type of way we connect with all these different relationships, right? Um, but how are we relating? Because our entire practice too is about relationships, right? And life is all about relationships too. How am I, well, internally and externally. So internally, how am I relating to my breath in my practice, if that's my practice of my breath, or my mind? What's the relationship with the mind? What's the relationship to a sitting practice? What's the relationship to our environment? The times we live in, the media we come across, our acquaintances, strangers, everything in life is relationships. So what is the best way to be in relationship with everything we're pretty much presented with that arises and then passes away in our experience? Yeah, and then relationships that go away, the separation too. So it's just like, and the way I find is bringing a curious, kind presence to whatever we're presented with, basically, right?
Good. Good. Okay. So
And yes, and so I just touched on all those briefly. We didn't dive in depth and if you're familiar with the 12 links of dependent origination, we didn't let it go too far into feeling, right? We just kind of made contact or touched into it. So, for better or worse, that's a segue into Denny's topic here. Take it away, Denny.
okay. Yeah. So again, I want to make sure that the people who are listening to this, whether in real time or in time shifted mode, that you understand that um, the topic of today is practicing in the desire realm. Okay, and so I think Josh talked about one aspect of that, which is if you're in the desire realm, how do you deal with all the um, contradictions in the tug of wars of your desire, with understanding that you are within the desire realm. So what I want to talk about is if you actually commit to a practice. And so there's two aspects to that commitment. One is that do you know where you're going? Do you know what's the objective of your practice? The second one is that in that commitment in your practice, do you understand the difference between what happens in as part of your journey and what happens when you finally reach the destination? Because a lot of times we confuse the journey from the destination. And so my topic has to do with the eight touches, and then I'll come to that in a minute. But I want to lay the groundwork by really talking about what exactly is the desire realm, by talking about what are the dimensions of our existence, because we typically um, think of our existence as a body, right? A material existence, a physical existence. So I want to say that in order for you to explore a spiritual practice, you have to understand the definition of the spiritual part of your practice, right? You know, so we all understand that there's one dimension of our existence is the physical part, and so we often use the word body. Now, I want to add the word Gaia to it because the English word body is used in multiple places. It's used like the body, which is like your skins and the sensory that associate your skins, but it's also used as all material. And so I want to go back to the word Gaia, which is everything that are physical about you. And so we summarize that either by talking about it in four elements: the earth, the, the, the water, the fire, and the wind. Or we talk about in terms of our six senses: the eye, the nose, the tongue, the ear, the skin, which is a better word for it than the word body, and your thinking brain. Okay, this is important that the body actually consists of your brain. So that's one dimensions of your existence. And so if you follow our practice, our Saturday practice, then you know that we're talking about energy. And I choose the word chi, which is a Chinese word, not an Indian word. Chi as in energy, as in circulations, as in energy. And then finally, we talk about the word mind, and there's actually multiple Sanskrit word, and the one I choose is called sita. So we at least you have to accept that. You have to accept that there is more than one dimension, because if you don't accept that, then there's nothing to talk about, because then spiritual practice doesn't make any sense, right? So because if spiritual practice means your brain, well, that's psychology. That's not a spiritual practice. Okay, so it's very important that you accept that we live in more than one dimension. Whether you include the chi or not, that's up to you. Now, being a modernly educated engineer, the physicists also define these three levels of existence. They start with the particle, then they also talk about the wave, which is the energy. And then more recently, with the quantum physicists, they talk about quantum information. I want to just kind of briefly touch on what does that mean? What is information? Information is data, right? So what they're talking about is that, for example, Josh is an individual, so am I. So we have our composition of our material, right? He has so many carbon atoms, and so do I. He has so many hydrogen and oxygen that mix up into water. And so in addition, he might have his own energy field, and I have my own energy field. But what if we were both jump into a black hole, and now everything kind of break down into its elemental form? So his carbon atom now is no different from mine, and so forth. And so what Stephen Hawkins and his fellow scientists are saying, well, that can't be right, because we have to be able to recompose them somehow. And so there has to be some kind of DNA that defines who we are. And so this is called quantum information, that there is something out there that really defines who we are. That somehow if that becomes the code, and if that if you know that, then you can put it back together. So I mean, back in the 70s when I was watching Star Trek, that was how the the what is that called? Teleprompter, or no, not teleprompter. The what is that called? Where you kind of go from one place to another.
Oh, the phase. Well, they had phasers, but it was teleporting.
The
Teleporting is what.
teleporting. That's how
Yep.
the teleporting worked, right? So anyway, so of course, we talk about the duality between wave and particle. So every particle, depending on how your perspective, how you look at it, then it can be a wave or a particle. Now, this turned out to be very important in our practice. This turned out to be very important in our practice, because a lot of students ask, they say, well, who was the one that either defined or discovered the chi, right? Because we talk about the six energy lines that originate from your fingers, six energy lines that originate from your toes, one that runs in the front. Who was the one that discovered that? Well, it was actually people who are meditators, So actually, if you attend the 10-day Vipassana class, at the very last day, they talk about things that you experience as when you leave the retreat center, that as you practice, you have this called, I believe it's called bhaka, where you start to, your body starts to dissolve, that you can actually see through your body. Because what happens is that you're so focused and calm, and you reach certain states of your meditative level, that your body starts to dissolve. And so this is essentially the particle wave duality, that what you think is particle can actually be wave. And these energy lines, these meridian lines, were actually discovered by people who had reached that level. That they all of a sudden, they see beyond their body, and they start to see these energy lines. So, um,
Yeah, I was
and
gonna
so,
I was gonna jump in real quick, and that's what I hear too from advanced Vipassana meditators, that there really is, even when you reach that level, and there is no really nouns anymore. Everything is a process. So the perception that we normally experience life is, that kind of falls away, or goes deeper into what Denny was just describing, of seeing all these microparticles and this constant flux, that everything's changing so quickly that nothing can really solidify, even on a part, even what, we talk about, that we look at a solid object, but actually, if you could see it in a different way, or a more accurate way, that that's actually just small particles and waves, in a lot of space, right? So.
correct. So to, full disclaimer, at least for myself, this is all hearsay, okay?
Absolutely, same here. I've had gradations of getting there, but nowhere anywhere close, obviously, either. So, and then the quantum thing I wanted to say too, quantum information, that's on the kind of the micro scale, right? There's also a macro scale as well
Correct, correct,
for information.
correct. Okay, so I just want to say some groundwork. So let's at least agree, because before we can talk about practicing in the desire realms, these are things that we have to agree to, or at least open to. So we have to be open to the idea that we live in more than just the physical dimension. Now, whether it's three or five, or that's up to you, right? But it should be more than one. The other thing is that we talk a lot about yoga, or the yogic tradition, and I mentioned how what we do on Saturday is actually a direct um, um, uh, consequence of this yogic tradition, because we learn a lot about from Bodhidharma, right? He was the first patriarch of Zen Buddhism, and he was a yogi. He brought that set of skill to China, and in fact, when he brought that meditation skill to China, it has completely changed the game for the Chinese Taoists, that they start to really focus on more on meditation, because until then they were alchemists. So the word Dan actually means red. There's another way of saying red. It's actually the wax that you put around the pill that you swallow. So they until then they that's called the external Dan now, but internal Dan means that the energy within you. So we're talking about yoga, and it's important. It's important that in that what we call yoga in America. This is again, making sure that we understand we're on the same path, on the same wavelength. That what we understand as yoga in America is either hatha yoga or asana, right? And it's a very tiny part of the yogic tradition, yogic philosophy. And I use the word. It's like chop suey to Chinese cuisine. I'm not going to deny that it's not part of Chinese cuisine, but it's definitely not representative of Chinese cuisine, and at most it's a very tiny aspect of it. So when you then look at the yoga, this is what is called the eight limbs of yoga. Um, the American yoga exists in the bigger picture. That this is called asana. But look at the similarity between what is called the yogic practice, and what's called the Buddha practice. For good reason, right? Because the historical Buddha was a yogi himself. And so, for example, I think Josh mentioned the other day that there is something called the breath, the pranayama, which is the practicing of your breath. There is also samadhi. There's, it's all there. It's just different ways of interpreting the same thing. So I think it's important that we understand that what we call yoga, the original Indian word is called yuj or yuj, yuj. That one of the it comes from the word called yoke, right? Or the equivalent in English, which is the harness that the Indians put in front of the oxen so that they can be synchronized as they do the cart. And so the whole idea of yoga is to create a union between the body and the mind, okay? Or having to develop a harness between the body and the mind. So for that, if we go back to the last graph, then the chi, I call the chi the harness between the body and the mind. So I think it's important that we understand that even the yoga is not just a set of fitness exercise, right? Yoga is actually a spiritual practice. So finally, kind of bring it home. So what we learned, what Josh and I learned from our Master Jiru, is the stages of mind practice or mental practice. And so it starts with just knowing your mind. Always, do you even know, what you do? Are you sitting? Are you standing? Where is your mind? Then once you know your mind, then you start to quiet it. And quiet means that you don't follow. This is going back to what Josh said, is that, if it hurts, understanding the difference between pain and suffering. Pain is a physical pain, but suffering is when the pain is already gone and your mind still suffers. So in that case, it's quieting means don't follow. Let it appear and then don't follow. So I always use the example way back when I was a child growing up in Macau, and I remember it was a big event when a Western hotel first appeared, and there were two um, Indian guards, Sikh guards that had these covering, and they actually had shotguns, and it was very very big. And so I always thought about I will always remember them, and I remember them because it really best describe quieting, which means that they're like the guards. You're like the guards to your sense doors. So your eye, your nose, your tongue, your ear, your mouth. These are all your sense doors, and you're the doorman guarding these sense doors. So what does the guardman do? Well, when someone appear, when you hear the sign, but beep 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 like this, you greet it like the doorman will greet you. But once it's gone, it's gone. You don't follow that person to the elevator. Okay. So this is what quieting means, and then eventually contemplating and observing. And then it goes beyond that. And so I believe that the first three stages, which are not linear, they're more like in circle. A little bit of knowing, a little bit of quieting, a little bit of contemplation. In fact, Master always said that if you are moving, then you start with observing before you get to quieting. And when you're stationary, you start with quieting. And so it's a circle. I'm pretty convinced that this is what Master had in mind when he talked about mindfulness of body. Again, body as in Gaia. Okay, so mindfulness is sati and body is kaya. So it's very important that when you talk about mindfulness of body, you include your thinking mind in this. Now, I'm not, go ahead, Josh.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to jump in here real quick, and you know, well, a few things. These tend to kind of interrelate too, right? Because you can when the mind quiets or when the mind's quieting, then it's easier to contemplate the mind. It's easier
Yes,
to know the
yes,
mind. When you know
yes,
the mind, it seems to quiet down,
yes,
and then you can contemplate it more if you know a little bit more, and they just all kind of reinforce and build each other. Now, Denny got the advice some time ago by Shifu, Master Jiru, that don't get involved with your breath. Well, that option also exists when we're in meditation for our mind. We don't have to get
yes,
involved with the mind, right? And
yes,
then one other thing is that there is a classic image for mindfulness, and I've mentioned other ones before, but I think one I left out maybe, or maybe not, is like a guard at the gate, like Denny was saying, that if you, it's like a watchtower guards, or at the city walls, you have one gate and you have a guard there watching people come in and out, right? Yep, so that's the
exactly,
same kind of elevator metaphor.
exactly, exactly. Thank you, Josh. Okay, so with that, then I want to dive into this idea of the desire realm. Okay. And because I think from that it explains what George was talking in the early part of the presentation, and then it kind of brings up this other things which I call the eight touches. So this is a very complicated picture, and So I want to simplify it for you. So this is the part I would call this the possibility of existence, that it's now this is a complicated picture that I said. So what's below this red line is what we call the desire realm, or the sense realm, which actually is separated into the human. This is the human realm, or the diva realm. So there's actually a heavenly realm, or what we call the diva realm. So when you die, okay, now this is very important that we understand how the Buddhists think about uh, your eternal life. That it's different from other religion in that the Buddhist doesn't accept the possibility of a soul. A soul is actually a standalone energy form, if you like, that actually can go from one living vehicle to another. That's not what they're talking about. They're not talking about that. They're talking about information that is passed on from one entity to another, not the energy. This is important. This is very important that when we talk about the three dimensions um, of existence, when you die, your body ceases to exist as a whole. It still exists as atoms. The atoms go back and they're indistinguishable from any other atom. Your energy disappears because it meets the living body. What remains is the information. That's what we call karma. Okay. And so when we talk about dying and eternal life and how when you die, something remains that gets passed on to another living body, we're only talking about karma. We're only talking about the information part. Okay. So this is it says that you can live as a human, or you can live as a diva, or you can live in hell, or you can live in what's called a hungry ghost, or you can live as an animal, okay? Or you can live as a Azura. So just for us, for those who are watching, this is the teaching, and all of that is called the desire realm, okay? The sense desire realm. Now it turns out that you can go beyond that, and what beyond is what's called something called Brahma realm. Now some people get confused because the word Brahma exists also here, and they tend to think that this is Brahma. So that's not true. The Brahma realm is everything beyond the desire realm. Okay, so the word Brahma is actually the name of a god uh, in the Indian tradition, who is associated with the creation of the universe. Okay, so the traditional religion, not the Hindu religion, the traditional Indian religion is also monotheist, that there is only one God. So it's very similar to what the modern religion. And in that case, even that, now this could be different realm, and then that actually is separate into two as well. And so now you notice that there's 8 layers, one, two, three, four, and then four more. So these are called the four samadhi, the eight samadhi, sorry, the 8 different levels of samadhi. And we separate them into the form realm and the formless realm. So this is the realm where you no longer have a physical body, and what remains is pure energy. So by form, that's what we meant is that there's no more material. So if you don't have any material, then there's form, then there's energy. Now here, this little this doesn't mean, I don't believe that it means no energy. I think it means something that is less energy. Okay. Now keep in mind that the historical Buddha actually achieved the upper two, right? But he decided that even if you can achieve the upper two, that you can live beyond your physical dimensions, and now you go to the energy dimensions, and then even beyond the energy dimension to something else, you're still not awakened. So Buddha was the one that after he had achieved the very upper 2 layers, he came back and invented his own way. And his own way is actually the ninth samadhi, the ninth samadhi. So there are 8 here in the ninth samadhi. So now before I talk about the ninth samadhi, what Buddha described as samsara, which is the rebirth, is everything here, everything here. Not so you could be a diva and come back as a diva, come back as an animal, or come back as whatever, or you could even beyond the desire realm and then somehow eventually come back. So you could be anywhere in here if you are one of these, and that's called samsara. You cannot escape samsara. And Buddha, with all the teaching, is that how do you escape the samsara? How do you escape from the three realms and the six regions? Okay.
So just
Well,
a quick comment on that, Denny. Whoops, is that your mic or anyway? So yeah, if just for bookkeeping purposes, it's sometimes referred as the three realms, and you saw Denny's lines of three different delineations there, and I think it's all each individual one is there 31? Is that what it is?
yeah.
Okay,
Well,
30.
there's a lot. For
Yes.
example, yeah, there's a lot. Yeah.
And
Individual ones. Yeah.
the other thing I would say, instead of maybe coming back, or well, in a way it is, just taking additional birth, right? The next birth, a rebirth, because in Buddhism it's not known as reincarnation, it's known as rebirth, right? There's a distinction there.
Yeah, well, very subtle, very subtle. And by the way, when we say reincarnation, it's the word that it's the base word is incarnate. So before you jumped into that and say how that got be, remember that Jesus was incarnate. That is in the Bible. Okay. So anyway, so some of us we look at that and say, well, that's a bunch of crap. How could that be? Okay. So again, I want to bring you back to modern science. So in modern science, we talk about the different scientists that came our way. We talk about Newton, who discovered the effect of gravity. He didn't discover gravity, he discovered the effect of gravity. And in that case, he defined gravity as the force between two mass that's proportional to the the mass inverse proportional to the distance. That's how he defined it. When Einstein came along, he threw all that out of the window because what he was interested was the absoluteness of time, and therefore what he developed the discovery is called relativity. And so basically, he says that time should not be absolute. The only thing that should be absolute is the speed of time. In his case, so I'm sure someone else came along with something. And so when the time is relevant, it means that we can each have our own time. Okay, and
And
of
I'll
course
just
it's not random, it's not arbitrary, and the time has to do with material. So he even go further and says, well, because you have, again, he's talking about the different domains of existence. So if your existence is in the material, in the desire realm, then material has to have decay. It would come into existence and it would decay into non-existence. That's the nature of material, and because of that, you need time. But as you move away from that and you go towards regions where there's less material, then in a way, material is like the contamination. And when you finally get to the singularity where there is no more material, that everything is energy, then there's no need for time. And so he called that singularity the black hole. Now, is the understanding is evolving now. People start to talk about that as not the case, that we shouldn't call it a black hole and that we shouldn't call it a Big Bang. We are modifying understanding. But the point is that you can define your universe in terms of time. And if you take all the universe together that has the longest time span, then that actually corresponds to the regions where there's less material contamination.
And this is in a model where like time is the fourth dimension too, right? So if there's dimensions beyond that, maybe time will operate differently or not even apply as well.
Correct.
I just wanted to say that, even if you're not, there's no requirement, as far as I understand, in Buddhism to believe this, right? So you don't have to
We
believe
don't
this.
have to
Yeah,
believe
yeah,
it, but
exactly.
it is a consequence.
That's right. So that's another
It is
good
a
point.
consequence, and
The
so I wanna go to I always go to this movie, this
Yeah, let me just
Stellar.
real quick, Denny, a comment on the other one. That another thing is that advanced yogis, okay, it's interesting how what I hear, their teachers and stuff will send them into these realms to report what they experience. And it's interesting how a lot of their reports will seem to line up, even though they haven't ever even
Absolutely,
met each other.
absolutely,
Yes.
yeah,
And
absolutely.
then
Yeah.
Jenny
So
talks
yeah.
about
Hmm.
subtle matter too,
Hmm.
because so in these higher realms, maybe it's a form of matter, but maybe it's not the same type of really dense, heavy matter here. That's another thing I hear as well, like a
Yeah, so
subtle
you can
form.
go to YouTube and listen to talks by different gurus. And so one of my favorite is talks about how there were multiple occasions where he was in the mountain and he thought he was away for a couple of minutes. And when he came back, all of a sudden he saw everybody around him worshiping him because it turns out that he was gone for 3 weeks. You hear this kind of story all the time. Um,
There's even a phenomenon they call it missing time. Some people refer
yeah,
to as that. Yeah.
and in fact, Master Jew would talk about his own experience that when he secluded himself for 3 years in that trailer in Maba, that one day he was walking, he was doing walking meditation, and as soon as he stopped, he saw he woke up because there was very bright light in his eye, and he realized that the sun was shining through the window, and he couldn't understand it because he had just started. He had just started his meditation, walking meditation in the middle of the night. And so in other words, the total amount of time was gone. He was probably just out for a second and he came back, it's 6 hours. So the point is that this was actually depicted in a very famous movie, Interstellar, who was co-written and by a very famous scientist who recently received a Nobel Prize for gravitational wave. He was a professor at Caltech, and I was there for 3 years. So I actually saw him almost every day with Stephen Hawking having lunch together. But of course, I was at the kids' table at the faculty club. But the point is that the story was that, and this is according to the technical team who are all scientists from Caltech. This is true to their science, in that the astronauts actually landed in a planet called Planet Miller, which was orbiting a black hole, and so they had some delay and they were there for 3 hours. And then when they came back to the spaceship, which was orbiting outside of the influence of the gravitational field, his companion had aged tremendously, because every hour on the planet Miller was 7 years on Earth. Now, the Buddhists have the same thing. The Buddhists have the same thing, that when we talk about the Diva realm, the one that was still inside the desire realm, that each layers have a different time. And so Planet Miller, every 24 hours is 168, is somewhere between the Yama and the Shita, to Shita, somewhere in there. So this is, I'm not saying that it's true or not. I'm just saying that at least they're consistent with another. All right. I want to go back to the teaching of the historical Buddha. What is it about the ninth samadhi? What is he trying to say to us? So just a couple of days ago, maybe it was even yesterday, I got my new toy working, my Apple TV, so I was able to watch something on Apple TV, and they had this great documentary called The First 2,000 Days. So they actually had children from all over the world, and they were observing them from the day that they were born to when they were ready for kindergarten. And one of the things that struck me was that before the kids were 2 years old, they had no idea who they are. So one segment of the movie was the baby was looking at the mirror, and she saw herself and her mother, and she recognized her mother, but she didn't recognize herself. She had no concept of herself. and she was actually interacting with the other baby as if it was just another baby. They have no concept of property. It's not their toy versus someone else's toy. And so I got to think about that a little bit, and I said, that's the difference between the spiral core and the thinking mind, the brain. That a child in the early stages of development, the brain hasn't been developed yet, but the spiral core are fully developed. So they are capable of sensing, but they're not capable of intent. Okay, but as they get older, all of a sudden they recognize that that's who they are, and so all the quote unquote human characteristics will come out. They start to argue with their parents. They don't want to do this. They want this is what they want. They don't all that. And so if you want to understand that in terms of the Buddhist teaching, we talk about the five skandhas. We talk about the form as being everything that is physical, not just with us, but also with the outside world. So this is when we talk about the eye, the ear, the nose, but also talk about this, the sound, the sight, the smell, and so forth. So everything that is physical is called form. And so when our eyes touches the outside world, when the physiology engage the physics, it generates neurology. And so the whole thing about sensation is really creating those neural signal. Now, keep in mind that all our nerve endings are at the spiral cord. Okay, so the spiral cord, if it's a co-equal partner of to the brain, then it is the part that is responsible for sensation. Now, it's only after that it collects all that electrical signal that it delivers something to a central brain, to a thinking brain, and it's at that stage called perception, which is really what we call the mind. And the mind has two parts. It has the physical part, which is called the thinking mind, the brain. Then it has the mental part, the spiritual part, which is actually what we call the seventh consciousness. For those who are interested in studying further, that's what we call the ego or the self. This is when we start to um, engage, right? And so what Buddhist is talking about is that the only way that you can escape samsara, the only way that you can become awakened is to understand the difference between sensation and perception. And what he's talking about right here is no thinking mind, no thinking mind. That sensation without perception or attention without intention, right? So this is our practice. This is our practice. Is how do we get there? How do we experience it? Now, keep in mind that all the athletes, if Josh and I were coaches, and we're trying to coach people to swim or to run or whatever, that's what we would say is that don't think about it, just do it.
One way I've heard this put, Denny, is there's a difference between our experience and our interpretation of our experience, right?
Right.
Because our experience is this sensation for the most part, right?
Right.
What these sensations are. And then when we go to try to either put images or language to that, that's our interpretation of those sensations. That's a perception trying to describe our experience.
Yes, yes, that's correct. That's correct. Now, so I'm now ready to talk about the eight touchers or the eight contexts because when during the Saturday class, many times the students at the end of the class would ask a lot of questions. What do you think of this? What do you think of that? And I get asked a lot privately through direct text messages about my experience with this, my experience with this, and all that. And I think the last time I talked about this is I said those are all those feelings and perception, they have to do with our body. Okay, they are part of the journey. Don't think of them as the destination of your journey. You're supposed to get past that. So one time I used the example, I talked about how I was actually at Maba during the winter retreat. I was there for 3 weeks and really getting into the practice and I noticed that when I after I finished walking meditation, half my face were numb. And so I raised my hand, asked Master the question, and then he started talking about the 8 touchers. And he says that's a consequence of you quieting your body without quieting your mind. See, this is the problem. I see many times that this is the big problem with meditation. There's even an article that says that meditation is bad for you. It's bad for you because if you actually walk that path and you don't understand that when you say body, it meant Gaia, and Gaia includes the thinking mind, then all you're doing is quieting your 5 senses, your eye, your nose, your mouth, your ear, and your body, without quieting your thinking mind. And so what happened now is that you're actually supercharging your perception. See, as you walk down this path of form, sensation, and perception, you don't know how to put you don't know how to cut off between the sensation and the perception. So so Josh mentioned the 12 links of dependent origination. It's the same thing over there, that if you start with ignorance, which is a seed for your hindrances, and you walk down the path, and if you don't know how to stop at the contact point, then it will continue. This is actually samsara of our mind. Okay, so in our spiritual path, it's really important that we learn to shut off, or at least tame our thinking mind. Because if you don't do that, this is what happens. If you don't do that, then all of a sudden you have these sensations, these experiences, and it gets very confusing. And especially if you don't have an instructor that can guide you, like Master Ju would guide us, right? Then this is actually very dangerous. I know many cases people actually hallucinate. Okay, now I would get in trouble, but I would mention it. Many religious meditations, they do it for that purpose. This is their destination, that they want to be with God. And they think that by seeing light is the destination. By seeing light is their ability to see God. Whereas in our teaching, light is weightlessness, or a combination of warmth, a combination of that. So I'll break it down now. Some people call this the 8 contacts. Some people call it, I just call it 8 touches because I don't want to confuse contact with something else, because contact is a different meaning, a different context. So these are the things that your sensory door, your sensory 6 senses will start to feel, will start to sense, because you're so completely successful in shutting yourself down that without shutting down the thinking mind. This is the thinking mind at work. For example, there are people who say, I would meet somebody that I haven't seen in many years, and I talk about them, how I get into meditation. And jokingly, only half jokingly, he says, "Oh, how many feet can you jump?" There are people who can meditate and levitate themselves, or at least jump up and down, because this is one of the big things. This is one of the most common touches, which is that it's an interaction of all 4 elements in your body, that you start to start to move, or start to gyrate, or start to go up and down. Okay, so this is a big thing. Your body start to feel itchy or numbness. It's the sensation of your nerve system, uh, feeling very cold, feeling very hot. This is the exaggeration of the wind element, which is you start to feel light as if you're flying, as you're flying through. Now, I don't have this. I actually have a little bit of the heaviness, that I feel like my half of my face is not within my control anymore. That is, I'm being cut off from it. This is another thing. The body feels light, bright. So a lot of people said, one student came to me privately and says, "I want to learn how to practice because I want to be closer with God." Where does God reside? God resides in the Brahman space, outside the desire space. It's good. Maybe that's true. I'm not saying no, and so I'm saying, well, just keep coming to class then. and then all that. Okay, so these are the 8 touches, and they are a result, as far as I understand, of us not able to tame our thinking mind. This is going back to the last one now. It's very, very important that you understand the 5 skandhas, that you understand how sensations lead itself to perception, that you understand that our practice is about not going to perception, because the the original Buddha was the one that says that in order to break out of these 3 realms and go beyond the formless realm, you have to do this perception, sensation without perception.
Well, and Denny, I think we're going to have to wrap it up here soon. I appreciate that. I think I might have had to. We'll have to put off the other topic I had potentially for another time, perhaps. Now, I want to
It's
say
always
that
good to leave some behind.
yes, maybe a teaser for the next time. Oh yeah, and of course, yeah, letting go, right? So, now I want to say a comment. The 8 touches. I guess I wasn't familiar with these, and this is not an invalidation. I will say that was reminded me a lot. I think there was only one that wasn't on there. Some of the 4 element practices, I think maybe in the Pa'a tradition, during some of the Samatha practices and some of the jhana practices, part of it will lead up to a 4 elements practice. And one of the things is actually going through, like for the earth element, paying attention and investigating in the body the hardness, the softness, the roughness, the smoothness, and I forget there's another one. And then for air, it is the kind of the pressure and maybe movement and support. And then for the fire, it's the hot and cold. And then the water is, I'm forgetting that one as well. But, it's really interesting because I guess it depends on what type of practice, what the intent is, and then I guess also what the practitioner's predisposition is, if it's the certain practice is helpful or not, and then even more on an ultimate level of if you only have so much time, what's going to be the most beneficial here. So yeah,
I think, yeah. I just put this slide up again, and I wanna just repeat something that I said before, that um, I stay away from understanding whether something is right or wrong.
yes,
I stay focused on whether they're right for me or not right for me. So each practice has its own history and has its own groups of authority. So very often we get confused with the practice with the practitioner. Okay. So for example, in our Saturday practice, we talk about the microcosmic orbit. And when I when I would say that that's not the Buddhist practice. That actually is the Taoist practice. But it's a good, for me, it's a good warm-up exercise. It's a tool that I use. But keep in mind what exactly, what is the objective of the Taoist? The objective of the Taoist is very simple, that after the current life, they like to be reborn as a deva. So they're completely focused on what is called the heavenly realm. And so Buddha actually talked about this in the 40 forms of meditations, where there's one that actually combines all 4 elements, and that's exactly the microcosm of it. So there, you actually are using your thinking brain, because in fact, it is the thinking brain that provides the voltage potential that allows the electrons to go from your dantian up your spine and down. So there, that's
yeah.
now when you talk about the yogi practice, when the word yogi, actually they don't separate the word mind from Brahman. So when they say it's a union between the body and the mind, they are actually talking about the union between the body and the Brahman. So they want to be with the Brahman.
This is
And
this
so
is good.
they're talking about returning
Yes.
to the Brahman state.
And this is what the few key points I left out with that is that's not a preliminary practice, right? So from what I gather, if I'm getting this right, it's to build up a lot of stability to be able to go into that and not get so discombobulated. Another thing is I just recently learned that that practice, well, another thing, that practice, you're not using the thinking mind. You're noticing without any kind of thought, supposedly, if I'm getting that right too. The other big key point, and it relates to what you just said, is I just recently learned that that stuff comes from the Visuddhimagga, and who wrote the Visuddhimagga was it Buddhaghosa, right? Was it Buddhaghosa? And I heard that he wrote that because he wanted a rebirth in a heavenly realm. So the whole Visuddhimagga, if that's the case, was his way to try to get into a heavenly realm. So that's really important too. But then I also feel that that four elements practice is only practice with the intent that this is going to deepen concentration, deepen penetration into reality with the sole intent of reaching nibbana, not a rebirth in a heavenly realm.
Correct.
So,
Correct.
yeah.
Yeah. So again, it's important to understand the journey from the destination. So again, if I put up this slide again, answering that question, I want to learn meditation from you so I can be closer to God. So if closer to God is the destination, then these 8 touches is an indication that you have reached your destination. But if your practice is so that you want to be something else, and there's so much to choose from, then this is just part of the journey.
Very well put.
Okay.
All right, Denny. I appreciate this. This was a good show. Yes.
Some technical challenges today.
Well, yeah. Almost forgot about those.
Yeah, we got through it. It's good that we have so many tools at our disposal. If one doesn't work, we try another one.
That's right. Another key in the keychain.
Okay, I gotta fix up something and then I'll send you the link. Okay.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks again, Denny.
Thanks everyone. Everybody out there.
Yes.
We'll see you in a month.
Yes, and take what's useful and leave the rest, right? From this.
Not to us.
Yep.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank